The early morning sunlight filtered through Ethan's bedroom blinds, casting a faint glow on the piles of textbooks scattered around his desk. He groaned, rolling over in bed, his mind instantly bombarded by the thought of his upcoming calculus exam. His phone buzzed on his bedside table, the notification from a school group chat flashing across the screen. Anyone else stressed about Friday? Finals are going to kill me. Ethan swiped it away, burying his face in the pillow. He knew they were all stressed, but somehow it always felt like he was drowning more than anyone else. His dad's words echoed in his mind. Junior year is the most important. Colleges are watching. The pressure hung over him like a weight he couldn't shake. Downstairs, the smell of coffee brewing didn't bring the usual comfort. His mom was standing by the stove, flipping through her work schedule, barely looking up when he sat down for breakfast. His dad sat at the table, already reading emails on his tablet. The conversation between them was minimal. Brief questions about homework, upcoming tests, plans for the weekend. "How's calculus going?" his dad asked, not looking away from the tablet. Ethan took a slow bite of toast, delaying his response. "It's fine. Fine doesn't get you into college," his dad said, his tone sharp. "You need to aim higher. You know that." Ethan nodded, his stomach knotting even tighter. He knew the expectations. They'd been drilled into him for as long as he could remember. But no matter how much he studied, the equations, the integrals, and the theorems seemed to tangle up in his brain. He spent hours hunched over his desk, reworking problems, and it never felt like enough. At school, the atmosphere wasn't any better. The hallways buzzed with talk of final exams, college applications, and career aspirations. Ethan's friends seemed just as stressed, but there was something about their confidence that made him feel like he was falling behind. James, his best friend, casually talked about the physics final like it was no big deal. Emma mentioned applying for early decision at a top-tier university. Ethan kept quiet, not wanting to admit how overwhelmed he felt. In calculus class, his teacher wrote a complex equation across the board, but all Ethan could see were numbers and symbols that seemed to float beyond his grasp. He felt the pressure from his teacher, Mr. Walker, who had high expectations for him. "You've got potential," Mr. Walker had told him at the start of the year. "But you need to push yourself harder." Ethan wasn't sure how much harder he could push. Every night, he sat in his room, reworking practice problems, the walls closing in on him as the hours passed. His mom would occasionally check in, offering tea or a snack, but even her presence didn't ease the tightness in his chest. His dad, on the other hand, would come in, glance at the books, and remind him that he wasn't working hard enough. One night, after another grueling session of studying, Ethan collapsed onto his bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed with messages from the group chat again, but he ignored them. He felt like he was on autopilot, just going through the motions. Wake up, go to school, study, sleep, repeat. There was no room for anything else. His part-time job at the local library, which once felt like a break from the grind of school, had become another source of stress. He worked evenings, shelving books and helping patrons, but his mind was always elsewhere, thinking about formulas and essay prompts. The quiet hum of the library should have been calming, but instead, it only amplified the racing thoughts in his head. As the week dragged on, Ethan found himself slipping further into a state of exhaustion. The night before his calculus final, he stayed up past midnight, running through problems he could barely focus on anymore. His eyes burned from staring at the textbook, and his mind was a fog of equations and anxiety. When his alarm blared the next morning, he felt like he hadn't slept at all. The drive to school was quiet, his parents unusually silent in the front seat. He tried to focus, repeating formulas in his head, but nothing seemed to stick. By the time he sat in the exam room, staring at the paper in front of him, the panic had settled in. The first few questions were manageable, but halfway through, his mind went blank. Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the next equation. He had practiced this type of problem countless times, but now, under the pressure of the exam, the steps eluded him. His heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He glanced around the room, seeing his classmates scribbling furiously, seemingly unfazed. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second a reminder that time was running out. He couldn't focus, couldn't think. The weight of everything, his parents' expectations, his teachers' demands, the looming future, pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He scribbled down an answer, unsure if it was even close to correct, and moved on to the next problem. But the anxiety only grew. By the time the exam ended, Ethan felt like he had failed. He handed in his paper with shaky hands and left the room, not waiting to talk to anyone. Outside, the air was crisp, but it did nothing to clear his mind. He walked aimlessly, not wanting to go home yet, not wanting to face the inevitable questions from his parents about how the exam went. He ended up at the park near his house, sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. The pressure had become too much, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself cry, the frustration and fear spilling out in quiet sobs. He had worked so hard, had given everything he had, and it still didn't feel like enough. Ethan didn't know how long he sat there, but eventually his phone buzzed. It was a message from James. "How'd it go, man? I think I bombed the last section." Ethan stared at the screen, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. James was always so confident, and hearing him admit to struggling made Ethan feel less alone. But at the same time, it didn't take away the pressure he felt to meet everyone's expectations. Later that evening, when Ethan finally made it home, his parents were waiting at the dinner table. His dad's face was expectant, while his mom smiled softly, hoping for some reassurance that all their hard work had paid off. "So, how was it?" his dad asked. Ethan hesitated. He could feel the weight of their hopes resting on his shoulders, the pressure to be perfect, to live up to the dreams they had for him. But he didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I really don't know." His dad's expression hardened, but his mom reached across the table, placing a hand on Ethan's. "It's okay, Ethan," she said gently. "You've done your best." But as much as her words were meant to comfort him, they didn't. Because his best never felt good enough. The weight of their expectations still hung over him, and the fear of failure gnawed at him with every passing day. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself stuck in a cycle of doubt and anxiety. He couldn't escape the feeling that his life was spiraling out of control, that the pressure to succeed was crushing him from all sides. Even when his calculus results came back, and he had managed to pass, he felt no relief, only a numbness that settled deeper into his bones. He started skipping his part-time job, unable to focus on anything but the looming college applications. His grades in other subjects began to slip, and teachers who once praised his potential now questioned his commitment. His friends noticed the change, but Ethan brushed them off, saying he was just tired. But he was more than tired. He was exhausted, in mind, body, and soul. The constant stress had drained him of any passion he once had for learning, for achieving. He didn't know how to talk about it, didn't know how to tell anyone that he was drowning. One evening, after another argument with his dad about his grades, Ethan went up to his room, closed the door, and collapsed on his bed. The thought of opening another textbook made his stomach turn. He didn't want to study, didn't want to think about the future. All he wanted was to breathe, to escape from the suffocating pressure that had taken over his life. The next day, Ethan made a decision. Instead of going to school, he walked to the library and sat in the back corner, away from everyone. He didn't open his textbooks or pull out his homework. He just sat there, staring out the window, letting the quiet calm his racing thoughts. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to stop, to pause, to remember what it felt like to exist without the constant pressure of exams, grades, and expectations. It wasn't a solution, and he knew that the stress would still be there when he returned to school. But for that brief moment, he found a sliver of peace. And sometimes that was enough.